However, it is probably fair enough to say that the anti-establishment movement, spearheaded by Pak Ji-won and Pak Jae-ga, crystallized unconsciously in Kim Sakat's attempts to Koreanize Hanshi. He is a vital cog in the chain between pre-modern and modern poetry, but regretfully, he has been completely neglected by a poetry establishment that has problems with his moral stance. The years of change that blew in the post-Hideyoshi era were undone in the concentration on political survival under Tae-won-gun and Ko-jong, and in the return to imitation in the new literature of the early 20th century. The old rigid Confucian mindset remains dominant. Korean poets never had a vernacular mindset. When the modern poet sits down at his desk to compose a poem, he is not thinking of Hyanga, Koryokayo, Shijo or Kaza. The Ki-sung Chun-gyul mindset of Hanshi is the only road he knows to traverse. When literature begins and ends with the moral stance of the artist, Zen is sacrificed and art is strangled. Seo Jung-ju was the greatest poet of the 20th century, primarily because he eschewed the moral stance and went back to the passion of Shilla and Koryo for the spirit he thought should inspire modern Korea. This was the source of his greatness, not the sensuality and sense of original sin that the critics talk about. Sensuality he undoubtedly had, though it was largely imported from Baudelaire. But nothing could be further from Seo Jung-ju's heart than the Christian notion of original sin. Again, the moral stance is dominant. Korean academics spent 50 years looking for a Western prosody to hang on to modern Korean poetry. They tried everything from dimeter to pentameter. They even tried the Latin meters. They were looking to put square pegs in round holes. At the end of the search, all they could agree on was that the breath group is the keystone of Korean prosody. This, of course, is no information at all, since the breath group is the keystone in all poetry traditions, including English. When Richard Rutt in the 60s said that Shijo was a prosy poetry form, unfortunately he used the word rustic. He was beset by ultranationalists who accused him of denigrating a precious heritage. Rutt wasn't trying to denigrate anything or anyone. He was pointing out a fact. Shijo is prosy. You can write it in 4, 5, 6, 8 or even more lines. You can also write it in prose format, which is the way it was recorded in many of the great anthologies. There are no positions of strength in the line, no semantic function is assigned to syllable count, but none of this should matter. Shijo is unique in world poetry and should be cherished for what it is. And the Korean language is unique in that the language of prose and poetry are the same. This is not a mark of inferiority, but a mark of individuality. I mention these central facts in Korea's literary history because when you begin to think about exporting your literature, I'm thinking here of compiling anthologies and granting projects. You ought to think of the literary values of the community you are proposing to go into. You ought to select some works at least that are in harmony with the values of the target community. The moral system of literary value that prevails in Korea today is so at odds with our ideas of value in the West, even in periods when engaged literature is in the ascendancy there, that wrong choices are inevitable unless people with Western sensibility are at the center of the decision-making process. If you drop the name of Seo Jung-ju to a committee charged with compiling an anthology, will anyone say, ah yes, so high the sky, an orchid wondering why opened its petals wide? Or will they quote like the wind leaving the lotus, two quintessential Seo Jung-ju poems? Not a chance. The Korean professor would say, ah yes, Self-Portrait and Flower Snake are the heart of Seo Jung-ju's achievement. Most of them will not even have heard of the untitled poem I have just quoted. So we end up with anthologies of boring poems, no Zen in sight. Committees choose texts on the basis of moral determinations of words made 50 years ago, and then assign them to translators. Recently I was asked to translate 4 poems. All 4 are terrible choices. Asking translators to work on texts that do not move them is a baffling exercise in head-in-the-sand aesthetics. The Zen master says, words are fingers pointing at the moon. If you watch the fingers, you won't see the moon. The implications of this simple statement in terms of poetry as symbolic discourse are immense. It echoes the sentiments of Yang Wan Lee of Sung, who said, Take away words and take away meaning and you still have poetry. Igubo understood poetry in this way too. In reading Tao Yuan Ming's poems, he says, sublime rhythm is of its nature soundless, sublime language is of its nature wordless. The monk Haitian has the same idea in his delightful little poem, Small Lotus Pond. No wind, no swell, a world so various opens before my eyes. No need for a lot of words, to look is to see. The poem exists in the poet's heart, independent of the words and independent of any assigned meanings. Writing the poem is an attempt to put into words the complex of feelings, sensations, ideas, images and symbols that are in the poet's heart. It is an ordering of the inner life so that experience is felt on the skin. It is always a finite undertaking, never complete, an attempt to reach toward inner illumination, which is the poet's central task. He sees with his ears, hears with his eyes, smells with his lips. In 1996, Czesław Miłosz edited a book of luminous things. He focuses on the real and on the imagination and on the interplay between the two, creating an anthology that is all Zen, the soul of poetry. Beautiful things are not just symbols of moral beauty. The azalea, the pine, the bamboo are beautiful in their own right and have value apart from any message associated with them. Were I making an anthology of Korean poetry, this book would be my model. Every Korean mentored anthology I have seen lacks passion, soul, life and entertainment value. Selection committees pick the wrong poems and stories, and very often they fail to get the best people to do the translations because urgent other agendas of time and money are always operating. I once had the temerity to write that E. Kubo was Korea's greatest poet. The Korean reviewer of the manuscript was outraged. How could I blindly discount the poets of Chosen, he asked. For many years now, I have believed Korea's finest poetry was written in Shilla and Koryo, or in the spirit of Shilla and Koryo. The Shillihanga are unique, the Koryo Kayo are exquisite. Yugugo, Song of the Cuckoo, for example, is a brilliant poem. Any poet would kill to have written it. The pigeon has a doleful coo, the cuckoo is the bird I woo. It would be my first poem in any prospective anthology of Korean poetry. Yet Korean commentators never single it out for praise. They talk about the voice of the people and the voice of officialdom, a typical Korean allegorical approach, and they ruin an excellent poem. The two birds with their contrasting sounds act out a drama that is full of human implications. Unfortunately, little vernacular poetry has survived from Shilla and Koryo. Those few of us who read it for pleasure delight in the little we have. But for the rest, we must look to Hanshi for the heart and soul of the Korean lyric tradition. I think of Jungji's Death Song, Yi Lo's Night Rain on the Zheojiang, Lee Tae-hyun's Snowy Night in the Mountains, Lee Sek's Song of a Madman. Most of you have never read these poems, but if you want to understand the Korean poetry tradition, they should be on your fingertips. This is poetry of the highest standard, poetry that is full of passion. Unfortunately, it is a poetry that is as good as lost, since almost no one reads it. Ed Poitras and I got the first two translation grants from the Mounier Jinhung one in the 70s. Ed's was for a volume of Hwang Sun-won short stories, mine for a novel, Chae In-hun's Kwangja, which perhaps was Korea's most discussed novel in the 60s. The Jinhung one had a problem from the outset. There were so few native speaker translators around that they had trouble fashioning a viable translation department. They needed X number of manuscripts in X languages by X translators to put on the minister's desk at the end of the year in order to secure staff and a budget. It was a major dilemma. They solved it by using Korean translators. 30 years on, there are still very few native speaker translators, and the 번역원 needs X number of manuscripts in X languages by X translators to put on the desks of ranking executives at the end of the year. If you discount all the malsums, nothing has been done to foster native speaker translators. Deep in the Korean psyche, there's a firm belief that you can do it on your own. In most things, yes, but in literature, no. When I think of Chinese poetry, I think of Tang and Sung. I do not think of 20th century Chinese writing. In the case of Japanese literature, I think of the Manya Shu, not Yasunari Kawabata's The Snow Country. I would like to see a world where the mention of Korean literature elicits discussion of Korea's classical heritage, while recognising the best work of contemporary writers. Currently the opposite is true. The sponsoring agencies pay lip service to traditional literature while concentrating on contemporary literature. They want the Nobel Prize at all costs. I listened for years to talk about Kanga and Koyokayo as national treasures. I spent years working on drafts of these poems, deriving enormous personal pleasure and satisfaction from the work. But I discovered I was virtually the only man in the country with the slightest interest in these texts. Teachers and students had a certain acquaintance with them because they came up on university entrance exams, but no one read them for pleasure. The proof of the pudding was when these poems were published. The book of Korean poetry, Songs of Shilla and Koryo, was published by Iowa University in 2006. It was meant to be the first volume of a comprehensive anthology of Korean poetry from pre-Shilla to the present day. The book received excellent reviews, but in the 2 years since publication, it has sold only 400 copies, of which I bought at least 50. The tragedy is that for market reasons, Iowa is not interested in publishing the follow-up volume, Songs of Chosen, which has more than 500 poems. I find this enormously depressing. At the recent Asian Studies Conference in Atlanta, where the 번역원 had a book display, none of my books were on show. And when I asked why, they said, "We didn't know you'd be here sometime next." This was a forum where professors from a variety of disciplines could find textbooks for future classes. The lack of even minimal savvy is endemic in the sponsoring agencies. The focus of the agencies is on contemporary literature and even more narrowly on living authors because only the living win Nobel Prizes. The 번역원 has issued guidelines for literary translation that are appropriate for freshmen in a translation program. For example, there are directives like no word in the translation that is not in the original and no word in the original that is not in the translation. Sounds fine, but it's not a writer's point of view. This is academic parlance where rightness or correctness is everything. Kim Ok told us in the 20s that if a translation has not got something new, it is worthless. If your Korean is that good, read the original. Directives like these strangle creativity. Most of our translations are no more than accurate first drafts. These drafts need to be crafted into works of literature, but if you do that, you will fall foul of the evaluators. They will scream mistranslation. I read somewhere, man likes to think that 6,000 years ago, God made all the nouns and verbs and adverbs, even the prepositions, and every verbal thing that creepeth upon the face of the earth, and that none of these have changed since. Language, I'm afraid, constantly changes. What one man considers a mistranslation may be a very creative interpretation. Passing judgments on a text is a very tricky business. There may be different versions of the text or different interpretations. Hanwon Sunsing Lim often give interpretations that are at odds with standard academic interpretations, but far more in tune with the poetry of the piece. Stephen Mitchell translated the Tao Te Ching, a central text in Chinese studies. Mitchell knows no Chinese, but read it. It's a wonderful piece of literature. Ezra Pound's Chinese cantos are among the finest translation literature in the world. Whaley, Seiden, Sticker and Gale were all accused of mistranslation. The mistranslation label is the Purple Heart of translators. Those of us working in Korean literature all wear it, and this includes Korean as well as native speaker translators. Literary translation is yesul, not sao. We need to let air into our deliberations. The screening system governing projects must be changed. As it stands, the translator submits extensive samples of his/her skills in drafts of the project text. The project is then sanctioned or rejected. A second Shimsawiwan group may reject the completed text. There's an arrogance here that is both insulting and ludicrous. Upon completion, the manuscript should be sent to a professional copy editor, not a second screening committee. Occam's razor is unknown in Korea. Now comes the worst part of the process. Suppose the Korean reviewer gives a native speaker a D for English language skills. The sponsoring agency accepts that valuation without question and sends it to the translator, accompanied by an awful form letter that threatens dire consequences. Please, we're not in translation for this kind of abuse. Any system that accepts without review unfavourable judgment by non-native speakers on the English skills, I'm talking here of the English skills of native speakers, is looking for trouble. The form letter syndrome is very widely practiced, it's very dangerous and often leaves lasting wounds. Of course, it's not without its fun aspects. I recently got a form letter which read, "Dear Madam, Thank you for your incisive comments. They will be very helpful to us in implementing